Welcome to the MarkLogic Security video series from MarkLogic University. This video is the fifth part in a series of topics covering key concepts to master when implementing a security model in MarkLogic. In this video, you will manage URI and execute privileges for an application. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need to download and install MarkLogic. As we progress throughout this tutorial, we will refer to various pieces of code. These examples are available through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. And please keep in mind that this tutorial is part of a series, so if you'd like to follow along with the hands-on example, please start at the beginning of the series so you can complete all the prerequisite work. So what is a URI privilege? A URI privilege is required in order to create a document in the database. A user must have a role that enables them to create a document at the specified URI prefix. This enables you to create domains of expertise within your user community and give them control over certain parts of your database based on their roles. So let's think about the example that we've been working with in this series. We know that Bond is our user and that Bond has the secret read role. So the question is, should Bond be able to create a document at a URI of /secret/123.json? Well, the answer to that question is only if the secret read role allows it. And based on our initial security configuration, it does not. The only reason we were able to insert the documents in our sample project is because we did so from Query Console, where we were logged in as an admin user. Now, in our upcoming demo, we'll take a look at how to configure this appropriately for our situation to enable this exact scenario and give Bond the rights to create secret content based on his role. Now, this concept of URI privileges can be applied across different industries. For example, in financial services, you may have different roles for someone like a trader as opposed to an analyst. And you can set each of them up and enable them to be masters of their specific domain within the same database. And in a scenario where someone should have the ability to create any document in the database, you can simply give them a role with the any URI privilege. Let's take a look at URI privileges in action. So let's start this demo by navigating out to the files that you downloaded from the MarkLogic University GitHub site. And if you haven't downloaded these yet, you can access this content at the link shown below. And we're going to look in the episode 5 folder. And specifically, I want us to take a look at the file uri.sjs. Here we see a little bit of server-side JavaScript code that is going to recreate the example that we're talking about. We're going to use XDMP document insert to insert a document at a URI of /secret/123.json. This document has some contents, and we're also managing that permission metadata that we learned about in episode 3. So the question that we have is, will Bond be able to perform this function? Well, let's find out. In order to set up this test, let's start by opening up Query Console. And let's go out and import a workspace for this particular episode. So again, this workspace is accessible through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. And let's go ahead and import Security Episode 5. And when we look at this workspace, we'll see that in the first tab, we're going to actually load that module that we just took a look at. This is going to go out to our file system and load uri.sjs. Now remember, if you have placed these files somewhere else on your file system, please simply update this variable called file and change the path appropriately. And what we're going to do is we're going to insert this into the modules database. Now remember what we learned about permissions. And when we put a module in the modules database, we will want to set execute permissions. So we see that happening here when we load this using the XDMP document load function. So let's go ahead and select our modules database as our content source and run this code. Okay, now we have inserted URI.sjs, and we can see that inside of the modules database. Now what we need to do is test this within our application by logging in as Bond. But if you recall, in episode 4, we were experimenting with digest versus application level authentication. And when we left episode 4, our app server was set up for application level authentication with a default user. Just so we can actually test this as Bond and log in as Bond, let's take a look at tab 2, where we're going to actually change that app server back to its original setting of digest. So it currently was application level at the end of episode 4. We're going to use the management REST API and the server's endpoint to change that back to digest. So let's go ahead and run this, and once it completes, our app server will now be back to digest, and we can go to our application and it will prompt us to log in, and we can log in as Bond. So let's try this. Let's open up a new tab and go out to our application on port 8010, and specifically let's run URI.sjs. And when we run this, let's log in as our Bond user. And note that we get an error. And if we dig into this error, we see that it is a URI privilege error. And the message tells us that we don't have a URI privilege, and a URI privilege is required in order to perform that insert. So what do we need to do? We need to set a URI privilege on a role. And if Bond has that role, then he will be able to perform this operation. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go back over here to Query Console and take a look at the next tab titled URI Privilege. And here we're going to use the Management REST API to add a URI privilege. And we're going to give this privilege a name. We'll call it Secret Read URI because we're going to associate this with the Secret Read role. We need to specify the type of privilege, and this could be either URI or execute. Since we're talking about URI privileges right now, you'll notice we set the kind to URI. Then we need to define what domain of document content this should apply to. The action will describe that. And because we want to enable people with this role to create secret documents, our action is going to define the URI prefix of /secret/. This would let users who have the secret read role create any documents that begin with this URI. So to set this privilege, we will use the Management REST API and specifically the Privileges endpoint. So let's go ahead and run this. And remember, to set this up, you could have done this through a variety of approaches. You could have done it manually through the admin interface or scripted it with the admin API. We chose to use the Management REST API because it's a great tool for application deployment and automation. Okay, so now that we have created that URI privilege, let's go back to our application and refresh this, and let's see what happens. And we run this, nothing gets returned, and that's okay because if you think about what our application code was doing, it was simply performing the insert, and that was it. It wasn't returning anything. So the real test will be to see whether or not we now have this document in the database. So if we go out and explore our database, we should see secret/123.json, and there is our document. We were successful because we've now given the secret read role a URI privilege to create secret documents. Next, let's talk about execute privileges. Now, if you remember, back in episode 3, we had talked about execute permissions. Keep in mind that permissions are document metadata, meaning they are set on documents and apply at the document level. Execute privileges are enforced at the function level. They enable you to control who has the ability to execute certain JavaScript or xQuery functions, enabling granular control over your application. Now, out of the box, MarkLogic provides many built-in functions for you to use when building an application. And so it makes sense that out of the box, MarkLogic also provides many built-in execute privileges to control who can run those functions. And you can also create your own custom functions and therefore your own custom execute privileges for your applications. So let's think about an example using our James Bond scenario. Let's imagine that a suspected Spectre agent sends a text message about plans for a meeting, and that message gets intercepted by Bond's colleague Q back at MI6. Fortunately, Q has MarkLogic, so he is able to extract the geospatial metadata embedded in that text message from the mobile device, and then trigger a real-time alert that gets sent out to Bond in the field. And as shown here, this alert contains the geospatial data as well as the information in the text message itself. So Bond receives the alert out in the field, but he needs to use the app in order to determine what location these coordinates represent. In order to achieve this objective, our app will need to take that latitude and longitude and build a request out to a service that will return to us the actual location of that point. We can do so by sending a GET request to a web service, and internally this will use a built-in function in MarkLogic called XDMP HTTP GET. Now we know that Bond has been assigned the secret read role. The question is, will he be able to perform this action based on his current security setup? Let's find out. Let's start by going back to our Query Console workspace for episode 5. And specifically, let's look at the tab titled Insert Message Doc. And when we study this code, we see that we're using XDMP document insert to actually put that alert document into our database. Let's go ahead and run this code to insert that document. Now that we've inserted the document, let's take a look at the code in our application that's actually going to do the reverse geoencoding in order to tell Bond what that location represents. So let's navigate out on our file system into the episode 5 folder and take a look at execute.sjs. And what we see happening here is we're going out and reading that alert document that we just created from the database using cts-doc. Then we're going out and we're accessing the value of the latitude and longitude property. And then we're going to build a request. And in this example, we're going to build our request out to the Google Maps API, pass it the latitude and longitude data from our document, and take a look at the response that comes back. And in that response, Bond should be able to figure out the location of those coordinates. So let's go ahead and test this out. In order to test it, we're going to need to insert that module into our modules database. So back in our Query Console workspace, let's take a look at the tab titled Load Module. And in this code, we're going to go out and place that execute.sjs file from our file system and load it into our modules database and set the appropriate execute permissions. So let's go ahead and select our modules database from the content source dropdown and click Run. And if we just double check and explore our database, we should now see execute.sjs has been inserted. Okay, so let's go ahead then and go out to our application and let's run execute.sjs and see what happens. And what do we get? We get an error. And if we look into this error, you're going to specifically see that we are missing an execute privilege on a particular function. And it tells us right here in the error that we need a privilege on the XDMP HTTP GET function. In order to use that function, a user must have a role with an execute privilege on that function. We do not, therefore we get the error. So let's fix it. Let's go back to our Query Console workspace and take a look at the final tab where we will add an execute privilege. And we're going to apply this privilege to the secret read role. And when we build this request, we're going to use the privileges endpoint and specify the name of the privilege and the type of privilege. And in this case, the name of the privilege is XDMP HTTP GET, and the type of privilege, either URI or execute, well, this is an execute privilege. So let's run this in order to create the execute privilege. Next, let's check out what happens within our application. Now when we run this application code, we're successful in executing the XDMP HTTP GET function call, and we get the response back from Google. And if we look inside of this response, we'll see that this location represents a point in Barcelona, Spain. And now Bond has what he needs to be able to do his job out in the field. In this tutorial, we took a deeper look at how to manage URI and execute privileges. If you haven't done so already, as a next step, make sure you go out and get MarkLogic. You can download it from our developer community website and get a free developer license. You can reference all the examples in this episode and all the episodes in this series by going out to the MarkLogic University GitHub site. You can get more training by visiting marklogic.com/training to read more about all of our various training options. And you can continue to explore the various on-demand tutorials through our on-demand website or the MarkLogic University mobile app. And finally, don't forget to add MarkLogic as a skill to your LinkedIn profile.